Hey there, it's John from Heroes and Legends, and today we have another Commander 2016 deck list to go over with you. Today we're looking at Stalwart Unity, so this is the third in the series. The first day we looked at Breed Lethality. Yesterday we came back and looked at the aggro deck Open Hostility. Today we got a real interesting one. This is one of the maybe more bold and unique out-of-the-box Commander decks I've ever seen. I like what it's trying to do. Of course, we'll get into a lot of details in just a moment. Quickly, before we get started, though, if you check out the description below, you're going to see some links to our Amazon affiliate store. If you make any purchases through any links once you go into the Amazon store, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel, which is always very, very helpful. And I'm always thankful to the folks that look at that. And as always, thank you to the patrons on Patreon to really help make these videos possible. Having said that, let's get into this new deck. So first, let's talk about the main theme here. This is a deck, if you're the type of player that likes to kind of be the puppet master, if you like to sort of manipulate the other players in a game of Commander, help people out, but you're really kind of helping yourself at the end, but you're trying to give them card draw, you're trying to give them creatures to attack with, but really under the guise that they're just kind of beating each other up and not you. Well, if you're that player, you're going to love this deck. That's what this deck's trying to do. It's got some interesting sub-themes. I don't know if the sub-themes are always completely realized, at least out of the box, but there's some cool sub-themes that go along with this deck. But having said that, let's jump into the actual cards. And as always, we're going to start with the brand new cards. There's 15 new cards that you'll see in this deck. Now, some of these are starting to repeat more and more now that we're looking at this is now the third deck. So if we talked about one of these cards in detail over the last couple decks, I'll probably go a little faster this time around, but if you want my full thoughts, definitely check out the other two videos that we've already put out. And then, of course, we have two more to go after this one. All right, so starting out with our 4-color commander, we have Kynos of Tyro and Melitus. Hopefully I got close with that pronunciation. But this is your 4-color commander, so much like the other two decks we looked at, you have an option to use a 4-color commander, or you can use 2 partner commanders, which are each 2 colors, and we'll look at those in just a moment. Now, if you choose to use this commander really starts to set the stage for what this deck is trying to do. It's a 2/8, very high defensive creature with low power, and it's giving everybody at the table some kind of advantage. Now, for you, every turn, you get to draw a card and potentially put an extra land into play. Your opponents, though, have a decision to make. They either can draw an extra card or put a land into play from their hand. So they are getting something out of it. People will probably like that. You're getting a little more. Now, what I like about that is this deck has a lot of cards that are giving everybody a symmetrical effect, which is good for what this deck's trying to do because it's trying to play off that a little bit. But if you were to take this card in a vacuum and decide whether you want to play this in, say, another commander deck, I still think this is a pretty decent card because it's giving you more value than it's giving everybody else. And eventually, people might not realize that at first, but eventually you are going to come out ahead with this card. And again, it's a very defensive card, which is pretty good too in certain situations. So I do like this one. I think this is a pretty cool design. And as you see, once we get through the rest of these cards, it makes a whole lot of sense in this deck. Next, we have our first partner. Now, all these decks will have an allied color partner and 2 enemy colored partners. So you kind of have to play the allied one out of the box, and then you get your choice out of the 2 enemies. The allied one is Sidar Kondo of Jamura. I really love the art on this. I dig the Mirage feel, and the fact that this creature has flanking is amazing too. Like, that's awesome that they went back to flanking for this. But what this does is it's a 2/5, so again, more defensive than offensive, but creatures your opponents control without flying or reach can't block creatures with power 2 or less. Now notice that's creatures your opponents control, so it doesn't mean only you can exploit that. So if I attack, yes, creatures my opponents control without flying can't block creatures power 2 or less, but that's also true if somebody else attacks a different opponent. So it's really encouraging my opponents to start attacking each other. That's really what this is trying to do, and it could be pretty successful. Now, it's not a catch-all because the whole flying reach thing does kind of throw a wrench into it a little bit. And you might see this card and think to yourself, oh, well, we're probably about to see a whole bunch of really small power, high toughness creatures. That's what you would think, but that's not really what this deck's trying to do. It's maybe a little bit of a sub-theme, but it's really focused on other things entirely. Next, we have Crom Ludwig's Opus. This is actually maybe one of the best partners, I think, out of all 5 decks. I really like this one a lot. First off, it's a zombie horror, which does maybe not matter in this deck, but does definitely matter in the world of Commander, in the world of Magic. It's an Izzet partner, and I think there's potentially some strong Commander Izzet decks out there that could use something like this. You get yourself a 4/4 flying haste creature, but more importantly, whenever an opponent casts his or her second spell, you get to draw a card. And this deck is giving your opponents a lot of resources. You're going to be giving card draw, you're going to be giving lands. So this card really does make sense in this deck, even though thematically maybe it feels a little out of place. But the ability really does work well with what you're trying to do. But again, in a vacuum, this is still a really good card, because this is one of those things, if you're playing a big multiplayer game, people are trying to do their thing. They might not mind letting you draw an extra card here and there. Eventually, that could help you gain quite an advantage. Really strong, almost innocuous looking partner, and it has a pretty big effect. Granted, you're paying 5. A lot of partners only cost 2 or 3 or even 4. But by paying 5, you know you're getting a bigger, maybe splashier effect out of it. Next, we have the second enemy color partner, Ludwig Necro Alchemist. So I'll address the elephant in the room first. This card really, I think, disappointed a lot of the community. And one of the main reasons, I feel anyway, is the fact that this is actually pretty established character in the lore. We've seen Ludwig's fingerprints on all sorts of cards over the years, and he's a necromancer sort of scientist, almost like I guess a Dr. Frankenstein type. And I think people were really excited to see him on a card, and you expected, I don't know, something to interact with zombies or bringing creatures back from the graveyard or enhancing creatures, right? But you didn't really get that. You got kind of a generic ability. At the beginning of each player's end step, that player may draw a card if a player other than you lost life this turn. Now, that ability completely makes sense for this deck. Like, this is fantastic in what this deck's trying to do. But the fact that they attached Ludwig to this and kind of made him a small partner commander, I think that was a little disappointing to a lot of folks. I mean, and for the same reasons, the legendary werewolf was kind of disappointing when we saw that, right? So hopefully in the future, and I kind of feel this will happen at this point, Ludwig will get another card that's a little more representative of what he actually is. But let's talk about the actual card in a vacuum. I think it's good in this deck because, again, this deck is trying to encourage your opponents to beat each other up. So in that vein, this totally makes sense. In a vacuum, however, I can't think of a whole lot of other places I want to use this card, just because I'm just afraid that there's going to be times where I might not be able to do the damage to another player and get the card draw advantage. And if I'm opening this up to the other players to possibly get it, you don't want to be left behind. So, for example, the board state presents itself in a way that all your other opponents are attacking each other, kind of laughing, smiling, having a good time drawing cards. Now, you can't get in on that for whatever reason, and you start to fall behind really quick. Another thing that your opponents can do that you can't do is they can actually damage themselves to get the card draw. So if they have a card that says, pay X life and get this ability, they could do that and then go ahead and get an extra card draw. You don't have that option because you have to damage an actual opponent. Everyone else actually has the option to damage themselves. So they almost get a little bit of a leg up on this card than you do. So that feels a little awkward to me. So I don't see myself playing it outside of this deck anywhere I can think of anyway. But it does make sense here, if nothing else. Orzhov Advocist. Now, this is a card we've seen in a couple of the other decks already. It seems to be repeating quite a bit. This does something interesting and maybe a little different in this deck, though. It does allow the opportunity to give +1/+1 counters to some of your opponent's creatures, where that felt like kind of a drawback or maybe a political ploy in the other decks. This time around, it feels like, well, yeah, this makes sense, because what this deck's going to do, and you're going to see it shortly, it's going to try to build this wall of defense. And if you can make all your opponent's creatures better and they can't attack you, well, guess what? They're going to have incentive to attack each other. And that's what this card is doing in this deck. Yes, it's a little intriguing to me that it's a 1/4, so that's fine. It's putting a couple counters on one of your creatures potentially, and that could make it so that it no longer fits the 2 or less power requirement. But you know what? Like I said at the beginning, that's a sub-theme. It's really not what this deck's trying to do. It's kind of there if you need it, but this deck's not going to focus on that. Selfless Squire. This is the first time we've seen this one, and it's a great combat trick. I mean, if somebody is attacking in you can play this and just absorb all that damage and have a real huge creature after the fact. That's actually pretty cool. That means, to me anyway, this is a pretty good card in a vacuum outside of this deck. In this deck, it's kind of working as a panic button in case something goes wrong. You're going to notice that there are a few really strong removal cards too you're going to see in this deck, that just in case your defenses fail for some reason, you have another backup. Seeds of Renewal. This is the Undaunted card for this deck. Each deck has one. This time around you get to do a double regrowth, so fantastic card in general. Again, it's not doing anything super special in this deck, it's just really good. Migration Route. We saw this one yesterday, and I kind of gushed over it, so I'll try to keep it short today. But it has basic land cycling, and you can create 4 1/1 flying bird tokens. For 5 mana, very economical. I like it a lot. Again, it's not doing anything super special in this particular deck as opposed to another one, but it's just another real good card. Treacherous Terrain. We saw this one yesterday, so again, I won't spend too much time, but I will say this card is almost better in today's deck than yesterday's deck, because again, if all your opponents are attacking each other and you're kind of playing the Puppet Master and messing with them, well, once everybody's life totals get low, you could spring this and probably take out maybe even a couple players at once. This actually is a pretty strong card. Entrapment Maneuver. Okay, so here's another one of those kind of catch-all cards if something does go wrong. And it's not as good as maybe some of the others, but you're going to see in a moment, there's a lot of cards in this deck that force your opponents to pay mana for each creature attacking you. And if that's the case, they might only be able to attack you with 1 or 2 creatures, where this becomes a much more powerful card because notice target player sacrifices an attacking creature. So if they're attacking you with like 7 creatures, they would just sacrifice the smallest one, right? But if they're only attacking with maybe 1 that they can get by with, this becomes a lot better, and you're rewarded with some 1/1 soldier tokens as well. But I would say in a vacuum, I don't think this is a great card to play. In this deck, though, I think it makes sense. Benefactor's Drought. This is another kind of Puppet Master card in this deck. Yes, you could play it when you're involved in combat, but I think this is really meant to be more for when 2 other people are involved in combat. So think of it this way. One person decides, okay, I'm going to attack this other player. They have a few creatures tapped. I think I can get some damage across. You play this and you say, well, hold up for a moment. Hey, everybody, let's untap all our creatures and now have at it. Go ahead and make your blocks. And on top of that, I'm going to draw a card because you just get to draw a card to cantrip. And then all the blocks that occur, I'm just going to go ahead and draw more cards. So it can really just kind of mess with people and mess with the board state a little bit. I think that's pretty funny. Sylvan Reclamation. Again, this is the 3rd time we've saw this one, so I'll go kind of quick here. Basic land cycling again, and great effect for 5 mana. I said this last couple days, but I pay 6 for this and be fine with it. Evolutionary Escalation. Now, I was kind of hard on this card yesterday because I really don't think it's a great card, but again, it's a lot better in this deck. Like, this is a very unorthodox deck. And this time around, giving the counters to my opponent's creatures feels a whole lot better than it did yesterday. So again, I'm building this shield around me, and I'm making my opponent's creatures bigger so that they can just go ahead and attack each other with them. Yeah, by all means, this actually is a lot better here than it was in the previous deck. Prismatic Geoscope. This is interesting because it's a new kind of mana rock. It's a very powerful mana rock, actually. It gives you a lot of mana. And this is the only deck I believe they included it in, so not really sure why they felt this deck needed it more so than any of the others, but it is an interesting card, definitely good outside of this product as well. And finally, Ash Barrens. This is actually in every one of the decks, so we talked about this previously, but good way to kind of fix your colors for sure. All right, let's talk about the reprints. They went deep on some of these. So you're going to see a few cards. You're going to be like, wow, I forgot about that card. So let's start off with Blazing Archon. So this is a pretty classic card at this point. You see this in a lot of different places. Good commander card. It's a little expensive, sure, but you'll get there. It's commander. And it does exactly what this deck's trying to do. Creatures can attack you, and it gives yourself a nice flyer, too. Hushwing Griff. This one's kind of interesting. Now, worthy to note that none of your creatures have enters the battlefield effects in this deck, so this makes sense here, but it's not necessarily trying to protect against anything specifically. I think this was just a good opportunity probably to reprint this card. Windborn Muse, so it begins. Here's the first of many cards that are going to say, creatures can attack you unless. So in this case, controller pays 2 for each creature that he or she controls that's attacking you. And you also get a 2/3 flyer out of the deal too. Chasm Skulker, this is actually a really good card if you ever played it. I played it in Cube a few times, and it's quite strong as long as you have some good card draw to back it up. And even if you're just drawing your card for a turn, it's not that bad. It gets bigger every time you draw a card through +1/+1 counters, which is awesome. And then when it does finally die, that gets converted into tokens with Island Walk, which is great for Commander. So this is phenomenal. Great inclusion. And the card draw theme is another theme that's going on in this set. So there's a few ways to make all that card draw pay off, and this is one of them. Humble Defector. So this is kind of fun. There's a dual purpose to this card in this deck. First off, it does what this deck's trying to do. You play this, you draw a couple cards, you give it to an opponent, they get to draw cards. Again, you're giving your opponents the resources to beat each other. That's what you're doing with this card. Also, there's a card we're going to see in a few moments that combos with anything that you technically own that you give to another player or another player controls. So keep that in mind as we keep going. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. This is another, hey, you know what? Probably not the best idea to attack me. There's other people at the table card. This one's a 5/4 creature, which is a good blocker anyway. But then if your opponent doesn't pay 3 mana, you get a 3/3 red ogre token that you can use to block with. So again, just another incentive for folks to attack each other, not you. Realm Seekers. This is a great ramp card for sure. It's also a very good creature in a pinch. At a commander table, there's going to be a fair amount of cards in people's hands most of the time. You play this, you can have a very big creature in your hands, and then by removing the counters by paying a green and 2 each, you can search your library for a land card. Notice it's a land card and not a basic land. Reveal it and put it into your hand. That's kind of awesome. So again, it's going to help you make sure you hit your land drops. If you need to fix colors, you can do that. Or if you need a utility land even, you can get it with this card. This card's doing a whole lot. It's very, very good. Next we have Veteran Explorer, and this is a symmetrical effect, but again, it's giving your opponents the resources they need to take each other out. And notice that this is 2 basic lands put onto the battlefield, not tapped. So that's unique. Usually it's tapped when you see an effect like this. This card, of course, has to die to get there, but when it does, everyone's going to get a chance to get more resources, and this really speeds up the game. We're going to see that. A lot of cards in this deck will do a lot to speed up the pace of the game. Guafa Hazid Profiteer. This will do 2 things for you. Basically, it's going to protect you against a creature that maybe you don't have an answer for. Basically puts a pacifism effect on that creature. This taps, and you can do that at instant speed, so that's very interesting to note as well. Another way that you're going to probably keep people off your back. If this is sitting on the battlefield and your opponent doesn't have an answer for it, they're probably not going to attack you knowing that you could basically pacify their stuff, right? So this was kind of a leave me alone card. It also does allow for your opponents to draw a card though. Normally would feel like a drawback. In this deck, it starts to feel like an advantage. Again, you're giving your opponents the tools to beat each other, but also there's a sub-mill strategy in this deck too. Edric, Spymaster of Trest. This is one of those cards that I've always felt was designed for multiplayer, but kind of better or more powerful in a one-on-one situation, like in a cube. But in this deck, it totally makes sense. If a creature deals damage to one of your opponents, that creature's controller gets to draw a card. That could be you, that could be somebody else. But again, if somebody's attacking in another opponent, it's giving them resources to continue that fight. And also, it starts to thin their deck, which again could be relevant later in the game. Horizon Chimera. Nothing too interesting to say about this one, but notice whenever you draw a card, you gain a life. That's the main reason this is here. A lot of card draw going on. A lot of it's symmetrical, but that's okay. You're going to get a bigger advantage out of it. Progenitor Mimic. Just a powerful spell. Like, this is from, I think, Dragon's Maze, if I recall. I feel like we opened like a foil one of these in our Japanese Dragon's Maze box or something like that. I don't know. This card really sticks out in my mind for some reason, but it's a very strong card. You choose the best creature on the board, you get to copy it, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you get a token of it every time. So that's actually very strong and potentially could be another win condition all on its own. Rubble Hulk, another great card that's going to play well with the amount of lands you have. So now it's starting to make sense. Well, why am I going and fetching up all these lands all the time, other than, of course, to be able to play my spells and protect myself? Well, you have a card like this. Now, granted, there's not a whole lot of payouts for having a bunch of land, but this is definitely a good one. It gets power and toughness based on the amount of lands you have, and also that Blood Rush mechanic is no joke either. That can be a big combat trick, a big surprise for somebody for sure, especially on a creature with evasion. Selvala Explorer Return from the original Conspiracy. Again, another card that's going to give you a symmetrical effect. This actually does a few interesting things. First off, power 2, toughness 4, so it does fit into that sub-theme of being able to attack with small creatures. It also lets everybody at the table, including yourself, draw a card, so it plays into that theme as well. But this time around, you're going to be able to gain a little bit extra life and even add some green mana to your mana pool. So again, you're kind of coming out on top as always. Zedru the Great-Hearted. So this is a cool inclusion. This is the card I was alluding to earlier. So this gives you an advantage based on your cards that are controlled by other players. And at some point, if you need to, you can go ahead and take those cards back. Now, this card was a much needed reprint. It was from a previous Commander deck and never saw another reprint. I think it was up around $10 or so. This card can be played in a lot more spiky decks than this for sure. This almost feels like a sub-theme to this deck. It's just kind of a fun little thing you can do on the side. But there are decks that really make this the Commander and go all in on this type of principle. So it's kind of nice to see another reprint of it. Alright, let's move on to some sorceries. We have Reverse the Sands. Again, I told you we were going deep. Redistribute any number of players' life totals. Now, with all your life gain, you probably will have the highest life total most of the time, but you can really start to mess with other people's life totals if you want to. Or if you don't have the highest life total, well, wonderful, you're going to end up with it at the end of this one. Wave of Reckoning. I find this one kind of interesting because, again, this plays with the fact that you have low power, high toughness creatures. Again, they don't really go all in on that theme, but you do have a few creatures. A lot of your creatures will still destroy themselves with this card, but it's a panic button. If you need to use it, it's going to be there. Mind's Aglow. So this is a huge card draw spell. It only costs 1, and then everybody, including yourself, gets to pour mana into it. And based on how much mana is put into it, everybody draws that many cards. Again, this could, towards the end of the game, turn into a game-ending mill effect that could potentially hit more than one player. This deck is that far into the card draw game that this could actually win the game for you. Blasphemous Act, just a panic button again to take care of a big problematic threat on the board. Maybe it's a creature that has a ability you're worried about, or maybe it's just a creature that you're afraid could get by your defenses. One of the things that's interesting about this deck is it does develop some really strong defenses. We still have a lot more to look at, but those defenses can be circumvented if your opponent has some mana on the board. So you're also giving your opponents mana and giving them card draw. So eventually they might be able to squeak by with like 1 or 2 creatures. So you're going to see a lot of spot removal type cards that are going to deal with some of these bigger threats. Collective Voyage. So another Join Forces cards. This time around, everybody pays into it, and based on what they pay into it, they get to take basic lands from their deck and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So again, another way for everyone to just go into their deck, grab bunches of lands, also thins out your opponent's decks nicely. Cultivate. This is a way for you to fix your colors and get some mana. Kodoma's Reach, basically the same card. Tempt with Discovery, another way to get mana. This one's kind of funny. You get to search for a land card, mind you a land, not a basic land, and you put it onto the battlefield, not tapped. That's kind of awesome. And then each opponent gets a chance to do the same thing, and then if they do, let's say 3 opponents choose to do it, you get to do it 3 more times. So again, you get to come out on top of the exchange. And this is a unique card. You don't see lands, especially not basic lands, coming into play untapped very frequently, but this card does that. Oblation, another card that's going to deal with maybe that one threat you're concerned of on the battlefield. It is target non-land permanent, so that's very important. Or you could simply just use it on something you have to draw more cards if you need to. Swords to Plowshares. This one's funny to me because we've seen all these like weird random cards, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, and by the way, we included one of the most powerful removal spells of all time. And here it is, Swords to Plowshares. So it's cool that it's reprinted. I mean, we've seen in the last couple of conspiracies, so the value has gone down quite a bit over the last few years, but it's still good to keep this thing in print because it is extremely powerful. And it's great in this deck in the way that I mentioned before, and it will probably make more sense in a few moments when we get into the enchantments. But if an opponent has a way of sneaking like one creature past, this is a good way to deal with it. Arcane Denial. It's a cheap counter spell, but it does allow the player that you counter the spell to draw 2 cards, but you also get to draw 1. So again, it kind of keeps with what this deck's doing, but it's a nice answer to a problem. Reigns of Power. This is from Stronghold originally. This time it got some new art. It looks really nice, actually. And this is a unique card. I mean, you untap all your creatures, you choose an opponent, they untap all their creatures, you switch creatures for the turn, so you basically can attack somebody with someone else's creatures. Or this combos with Zedru, and you can basically take somebody's creatures, give them yours, then take all yours back, attack them with everything. Great way to finish the game if you're just down to the last person. Could even be a win condition. So that combo is very intriguing in this deck for sure. Maybe that's why they put Minotaurs on the new art. Who knows? Swan Song. Here's another counterspell, but again, it's a counterspell. But hey, don't be mad at me. I'm giving you something. I'm giving you a 2/2 bird token this time around. So it just kind of feels like what this deck's trying to do. Beast Within. Again, I'm going to take something away, but I'm giving you something in return. I'm not that bad of a guy, right? So I'm getting rid of that problematic Planeswalker. That Liliana of the Last Hope, you know what? Eventually probably going to get around my defenses. So let's get rid of that and take a 3/3 green beast token, though, on the house. Ghostly Prison. Okay, so here we go. Here's the meat and potatoes of this deck. This is the first enchantment of its kind. We already saw a creature that does this, but again, it's going to make it much harder for opponents to attack you. Now, again, Ghostly Prison, very good choice for a reprint. This was in Conspiracy Take the Crown, but before that, it was a pretty expensive uncommon, around $8, $10 or so, so it's kind of nice that they're still finding ways to print this. It's a very good card. Hoofprints of the Stag. You wanted another payoff for drawing cards. This is it. We saw one earlier as far as Chasm Stalker, but this time around you get to put some counters on this, and then you can remove those counters, pay some mana to get 4/4 flying creatures, another win condition potentially. Spear of Safety. Another enchantment that's going to keep people from attacking you, or in this case, even planeswalkers you control, even though there's no planeswalkers out of the box, but just good to know if you tweak the deck. Propaganda, basically the same idea again. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature that's attacking. Lurking Predators. Interesting enchantment. I mean, definitely plays well with the Spear. You'll have another enchantment on the table for protection, but this doesn't necessarily do anything directly related to this deck. It's just kind of nice value, I guess. If you happen to get a creature off of it, wonderful. If you don't, that's fine too. That's really not what this deck's trying to do. Oath of Druids. Well, here's an interesting reprint. You're probably familiar with this from many Eternal formats, right? This card, even in Vintage, sees play. What this card's really trying to do most of the time in this deck is simply let your opponents get these big old creatures to beat each other down with, right? So again, hopefully you have all your defenses up. You play Oath. Now, there's always going to be somebody at the table that has the least amount of creatures, so almost everybody's going to get this effect every one of their turns. They are going to flip cards, get a creature, it goes right into the battlefield. Next thing you know, everybody on the battlefield has these huge battlecruiser creatures, and they can't attack you with them, so guess what they're going to do? They're going to attack somebody else with them. So what an amazing inclusion. Taking an older card, really looking at it in a very different way. And they even gave you Forbidden Orchard for when you get down to just one-on-one to perhaps be able to take somebody out and get value that way too. Rites of Flourishing. Another card that's just going to let everybody draw an additional card and also play an additional land. It speeds up the game again. Now we'll move on to some artifacts. We have a Crow and Horse. This is another card that technically you own that you're going to give to somebody else, so that could be relevant with Zedru. And yeah, also it gives all the other opponents 1/1 soldiers every turn with probably not a whole lot to do but attack each other. Assault Suit. Okay, maybe one of my favorite inclusions. You want a card that kind of sums up what this deck's trying to do. You equip a creature, it gets +2/+2 in haste. Can't attack you or a planeswalker you control, by the way, and it also can't be sacrificed, so nobody can kind of mess around with it. And then at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you can just give them the creature. So you pass the turn, and you give it the turn to the next person. Here you go. Take my creature with the Assault Suit. Oh, you can't attack me with it, so, well, guess you're just going to have to consider attacking somebody else. Now, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but guess what? next turn, you just hand it to the next person, you get to do it all over again. So you basically just get to pass the creature continually. It can't attack you, so hopefully your opponents bite and they attack each other. I mean, they might not. I think that's one of the risks of this deck is people are going to see what you're doing and they may start to turn on you because they know that you're just playing them on each other. So, but this card is just classic, just Puppet Master type card. It cracks me up. Commander Spear, of course, this is to fix mana. It also does let you sacrifice it for card draw later, which is nice. But basically, this is something you'll find in every deck. Imperial Plate, another payoff for drawing cards and keeping cards in your hand. Howling Mind, another way to draw cards. Everyone gets to draw an extra card every turn. Keening Stone. Okay, I alluded to the mill strategy. Well, this is your payoff for mill. Now, it's the only card, aside from the actual like draw card spells that we've seen. But if you do get to the point where everyone's taking each other out and you're down to just you and one other person and you have your shields up, Keening Stone could absolutely just finish the game for you. Psychosis Crawler, another payout creature that is going to get better with a lot of card draw. Soul Ring, they have included these again in every single deck, which is awesome. One of the most powerful cards in Magic. It's always good to see these reprinted every year. Temple Bell, similar to Howling Mine. Again, it's going to allow everyone to draw an additional card when you tap it. Venser's Journal, you do not have a maximum hand size, so that's very good with all this card draw, and also you'll be able to gain life off of it. Alright, let's move on to the lands. Now, a lot of these will be just for mana fixing, but you have Azorius Chancery, of course this is a bounce land. Command Tower, again another commander staple, great for fixing. Evolving Wilds, another classic card that's going to help you get the right mana. Exotic Orchard, a little variance involved in this card, but hey, you're playing Commander, you should be able to find the colors you need. Forbidden Orchard, okay, I kind of spoiled this one earlier, granted, but it's great for mana fixing, but also phenomenal with Oath if you're just down to one other player. Frontier Bivouac, and this is a tricolor land. Gruul Turf, another bounce land. Homeward Path, another card that allows you to take your stuff back. So again, it's more of a sub-theme than anything in this deck, but there are a few cool combos. Izzet Boilerworks, another bounce land. Jungle Shrine, another tricolor land. Crozen Verge. If you're not familiar with this card, basically it's a really slow double fetch land. So it comes into play tapped, you have to pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it to activate, but then you get to take a forest and a plains card from your library and put them into play tapped. So obviously it's really a card that's not super exciting when you compare it to a fetch land, but it's good fixing for here. Myriad Landscape. Again, this is another slow one. I mean, it does help with your fixing, but you do have to pay 2, sacrifice it, tap. It comes into play tapped. But if you do, you get to find 2 basic land cards and put them in the battlefield tapped. They do have to share a land type, though. Mystic Monastery, another tricolor land. Opal Palace, great for fixing. Also helps pump your commanders a little bit. Rupture Spire, another good fixing card. Seaside Citadel, another tricolor card. Selesnya Sanctuary, another one of the bounce cards. Terramorphic Expanse, pretty much the same thing as Evolving Wilds. And finally, we have Transguild Promenade, and this is very similar to Rupture Spire. One thing I noticed about the mana base here is they really went deep with ways to fix your colors. I mean, they did in all 5 of the decks, but this one feels especially deep to me, which makes me think that during playtesting, they found that it was really imperative for this deck to hit its colors. Alright, let's look at the basic lands. We have 5 plains, and I mentioned this last couple of videos, but the art is beautiful on all these basic lands. We have 5 islands. We have 5 mountains, and you guessed it, 5 forests. So that is the complete deck list. To sum up my thoughts on this deck, again, without playing it, just looking at the cards, I actually think it's a really cool idea. It's a very bold idea for an out-of-the-box commander deck. Like, it's going pretty deep. I mean, look at the other decks we've seen. I mean, we saw a deck that is based on +1/+1 counters. We saw a aggressive deck yesterday. We're going to look at an artifact deck in a couple days. Like, those are kind of your just standard archetypes, right? This is something really unusual. It's a defensive kind of wall style deck, but it takes it to the next level, really trying to manipulate your opponents into doing your bidding. It seems like a lot of fun. I will say, though, some of these sub-themes don't feel super fleshed out. I do think that this deck is a little precarious in the fact that it's really based on you getting those enchantments and those creatures that make attacking you difficult. If you don't get those, you're kind of opening yourself up to a beating, especially if people figure out what you're trying to do. Because there's so many cards that are giving your opponents resources. If you don't have those ways to defend yourself online, those resources are just going to come back to haunt you. So I do find that interesting. And again, the sub-themes, some of them are really cool, like the giving away things and then being able to take them back and such, or even just the extra card draw, being able to pour that into things like Chasm Stalker or some of the other cards. I really like those concepts, but even the mill concept feels like it might fall short sometimes. You're really trying to find 1 or 2 cards in your deck to make those sub-themes happen, and that might be difficult at times with a 100-card deck, even though you are drawing a lot of cards with this deck to begin with. So, I don't know. Again, I'd have to play it and kind of see. I mean, maybe the card draw is enough to compensate for some of the sub-themes feeling a little bit loose. But if not, I mean, you could always take out a few cards and put in some different things, build up some of the other sub-themes that you enjoy personally, and kind of tailor the deck to yourself and your playstyle. And I do think that's a cool thing with this deck. So overall, I like it a lot. I'm really curious to see how it plays and if it works. Again, I think the biggest problem with this deck is if people figure out what you're trying to do, you're going to become public enemy number 1. I think that's the biggest danger of this deck more than anything. But having said that, hey, that's the deck for today. We'll be back tomorrow and we'll look at Entropic Uprising. That deck seems very interesting to me with the whole chaos theme. And then, of course, we'll be back the next day to look at the last deck, which is the artifact theme deck. So, hey, as always, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks as always for watching. This video, like all my videos, was made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Even a donation of $1 helps me to keep growing this community and creating better quality content for all of you. Check out our Patreon page for exclusive giveaways and future goals for the channel. If you haven't yet had a chance to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the MTG news, spoilers, set reviews, product openings, or finance videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.